For some people, pain doesn't begin when they move. It begins when they wake up. At 6:17 every morning, Margaret opened her eyes. She didn't move right away. She lay there staring at the ceiling and waited. Not because she was tired, because she already knew what was coming. Her knees would hurt. Her lower back would hurt. Her hands would feel stiff, as if someone had quietly tightened every joint while she slept. She took a slow breath, then another. And she began the way she began every morning now, with a kind of quiet negotiation between her body and herself. First, she turned onto her side, slowly. Then she pushed herself upright and sat at the edge of the mattress. Her feet touched the cold floor. She waited again, one breath, then another. Finally, she stood. A familiar pain moved through her left knee, sharp enough to make her close her eyes for a second. "Come on," she whispered. There was no one else in the room. She wasn't talking to anyone. Maybe she was talking to herself. Maybe she was talking to her body. Or maybe, without even realizing it, she was already beginning another quiet argument with the pain. This wasn't an emergency. Nobody was calling 911. There was no ambulance, no crisis, no dramatic collapse. It was just a 72-year-old woman in Ohio doing something that used to take no thought at all, standing up. That was it. And yet some mornings, it felt like the hardest part of her day had already happened before she'd even brushed her teeth. Maybe you know that feeling. Maybe you've lived it yourself. Maybe you wake up, and before you check the clock, before you think about coffee or the weather or what's on the calendar, your body has already told you how the day is going to go. Maybe it's your knees. Maybe it's your back. Maybe it's your hands, which used to open a jar without a second thought and now hesitate. Or maybe the hardest part isn't the pain at all. Maybe it's what happens in your mind right after. What happens when pain stops being an occasional visitor, something that shows up after you overdo it in the yard and starts feeling like a permanent resident in your body? What happens when the ache in your knee is still there tomorrow, and the day after that, and the one after that? And what happens when the pain in your body slowly, quietly becomes pain in your thoughts? More than 2,500 years ago, a man named Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, told a simple story about a person struck by an arrow. We're not going to explain the whole story yet, not right now, but we will tell you this much. In that story, the person is hit by a second arrow, and the second arrow is not the one that lands in the body. The first arrow hurts the body, but the second arrow can change the way we experience the entire rest of our lives. To understand what the Buddha meant by that, we need to understand what happened to Margaret. Before pain became the first thing Margaret thought about every morning, she had never given much thought to her body at all. That might sound strange, but most of us don't. When your body works the way you expect it to, you don't wake up grateful that your knees can bend. You don't walk across the kitchen and think about the fact that your feet are carrying you. You don't climb a flight of stairs and stop halfway up to appreciate what a remarkable thing it is that your legs simply obey. You just live, you move, you go where you want to go. And for most of her life, Margaret had lived exactly that way. She had been married to Daniel for 47 years. They had raised their daughter Susan in the same small Ohio town where Margaret still lived, in a house that wasn't large, 3 bedrooms, a narrow staircase, a kitchen that had been remodeled only once, sometime in the 90s. But to Margaret, the house had never felt small. It had been full of life. There were years when the hallway was permanently covered in children's shoes. Years when the refrigerator door was hidden under school photographs and crayon drawings. Years when Margaret woke up on Saturday mornings to the sound of Susan moving around downstairs, already awake, already asking what there was to eat. Later came the grandchildren, and the house grew noisy again. Plastic toys under the sofa, backpacks by the front door, little socks that somehow appeared in places socks had no business being. Margaret loved all of it. She loved making pancakes on Sunday mornings. She loved taking the grandchildren to the park down the street, pushing them on the swings until her arms were tired. She loved sitting on the kitchen floor with them while they showed her things they were absolutely certain she had never seen before in her life. And she loved walking. That was one of the things she missed the most. For years, Margaret had walked almost every morning, not to train for anything, not because a doctor told her to. She simply liked being outside. There was a tree-lined street near her house, and in the fall, the sidewalks would disappear under a carpet of yellow and brown leaves. She knew which houses had dogs that would bark at her. She knew which neighbor put the newspaper out before sunrise. She knew exactly where the morning sun hit the sidewalk first. Some days she walked for 30 minutes, some days an hour. On weekends, she and Daniel used to drive to a park a few miles away and walk the loop together. They'd complain about the weather, they'd talk about Susan, they'd argue gently about where to go for lunch afterward. They'd laugh about things that would have sounded completely uninteresting to anyone listening in. Those were ordinary days. And Margaret had no idea back then how precious ordinary days were. There's a pair of walking shoes still sitting in her garage, worn down at the heels. Soles faded almost smooth. There's still a little dried mud caught in the grooves from one of the last trails she and Daniel walked together years ago now. She hasn't thrown them away. She can't quite explain why. Maybe she isn't ready to admit what they represent. Next to the shoes is a pair of gardening gloves, stiff with age. The fingertips stained a permanent green-brown from years of digging in the same flower bed along the side of the house. Margaret used to spend whole Saturday afternoons out there kneeling in the dirt, planting tomatoes and marigolds while the radio played through the open kitchen window. And on the hallway wall, in a frame that's a little crooked, now there's a photograph of Margaret at 65, crouched down between two grandchildren, all three of them squinting into the sun, all three of them laughing at something the camera never caught. The car is still in the garage too. She used to drive it everywhere, to the grocery store, to church, to Susan's house across town, to the fabric shop she liked, to nowhere in particular, just to feel like going somewhere. These objects don't look like much. A pair of shoes, some gloves, an old photograph, a car that mostly sits still now. But they were proof of a kind of freedom Margaret had never once had to think about. Then sometime in her 60s, her right knee began to ache. At first, she barely noticed. She assumed she'd simply overdone it too much time, kneeling in the garden maybe, or one walk that went a little farther than usual. "It's just my knee," she told Daniel. She rested for a few days. The pain eased. Then it came back. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single afternoon she could point to later and say, "That's the day everything changed." Instead, the change crept in quietly. A little less walking, a little more resting, a little more hesitation before standing up from a chair. And slowly, without quite noticing it happening, Margaret began asking herself questions she had never asked before. Are there stairs where we're going? How far is the parking lot from the door? Will there be somewhere to sit if I need to? What if it gets worse while I'm out? What if I fall one by one? Those questions began deciding things for her, which invitations she accepted, which ones she quietly turned down, how far she was willing to walk from the car, whether a trip to the grocery store felt like an errand or an ordeal. Her physical world, once as wide as a morning walk under the trees, began closing in around her inch by inch, the way a room seems to shrink when the furniture keeps getting rearranged closer to the center. The cruelest thing about chronic pain is not always the intensity of the sensation. Sometimes it's the way pain quietly changes the size of your life. Margaret hadn't lost her whole life. Not really, not yet. But she had begun to live as though she had. There's a particular kind of mourning that people who live with chronic pain will recognize immediately. It's not the pain itself that defines the mourning. It's what the mind does the moment before the eyes even open. For Margaret, it had become a kind of ritual, though she never would have called it that. She would wake up and before coffee, before breakfast, before checking the weather, before even thinking about her grandchildren or what she might do that day, one question arrived first. How bad is it going to be today? She didn't decide to ask it. It simply showed up the way an uninvited guest lets themselves in through a door that was never quite locked. And once that question arrived, everything else lined up behind it. She would lie there for a moment running a quiet inventory. Knee aching, but manageable. Back stiff, worse than yesterday. Hands tight, especially the left one. And based on that inventory, she would begin planning her entire day. Not around what she wanted to do, around what her body might allow. If Susan called and asked if she wanted to come along to the farmer's market, Margaret would find herself doing the math before she even answered. How far would she have to walk? Would there be a place to sit? What if her knee gave out halfway through? Somewhere along the way, I'd love to, had quietly turned into, let me see how I'm feeling. And, let me see how I'm feeling, had more often than not turned into no. This is something many people who live with ongoing pain will understand instantly, and something people who don't will rarely think about at all. It isn't only that pain hurts, it's that pain starts to make decisions for you. It gets a vote in almost everything. Whether you go to the party, Whether you take the stairs or wait for the elevator. Whether you offer to carry the groceries in or let someone else do it again while you stand there feeling a small sharp sting of something that isn't quite the knee. Margaret began to notice thoughts moving through her mind that she didn't remember having a few years earlier. I'm becoming a burden. My daughter has to worry about me now. I used to be the strong one in this family. I hate needing help with things I used to do without thinking. My body is turning against me. What's even the point of making plans if I might have to cancel them? What if this only gets worse from here? If you're watching this and any of those thoughts feel familiar, you're not alone and you're not being dramatic. These are some of the most common thoughts among people living with chronic pain, especially as they get older. They are not signs of weakness. They are not signs of a bad attitude. They are simply what a thinking, feeling human mind does when the body it depends on starts to feel unreliable. There's an old habit many of us fall into without noticing. We start to define ourselves by what has gone wrong. Margaret had spent 72 years being a daughter, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a gardener, a walker, a woman who made pancakes on Sunday mornings and laughed too loud at her own jokes. But somewhere in the last several years, without ever choosing to, she had started introducing herself, at least in her own mind, a little differently. I'm the one with the bad knee. I'm the one who can't walk very far anymore. I'm the one who has to be careful. I'm not who I used to be. That last thought is worth sitting with for a moment because it points to something important, something we'll come back to again and again in this video. Margaret was not only experiencing pain, she was beginning to experience a story about her pain. The pain itself was a sensation, real, physical, something happening in her knee, her back, her hands. But the story was something else entirely. The story said, this pain means I am declining. This pain means I am becoming less than I was. This pain is the beginning of the end of the life I recognize. And here's the thing about stories like that. Once they start, they don't stay quiet. They attach themselves to almost everything. A single difficult morning stopped being just a difficult morning. It became evidence, proof that things were only going to get worse. A confirmation of a fear Margaret hadn't even said out loud yet. Not to Daniel, who had passed 6 years earlier, not to Susan, not even fully to herself. She would sit at her kitchen table some mornings, coffee going cold in front of her, and simply stare out the window at the backyard, at the flower bed she used to tend, now mostly overgrown, and feel something heavier than the ache in her knee. She felt like she was disappearing. Not all at once. Slowly. The way a photograph left in the sun for years will fade so gradually that you don't notice the color leaving, until one day you hold it up and barely recognize the person in the frame. Margaret didn't have a name for what she was going through. She only knew that she was tired of waking up and immediately checking in with her pain the way you might check in with a difficult relative you can't avoid. Tired of feeling like her body had become a stranger she now had to negotiate with every single day. And somewhere deep inside, in a place she hadn't quite let herself look at directly, she was beginning to wonder something much bigger. Was this what getting older actually meant? Not just aching joints and slower mornings, but slowly, quietly, losing everything that had made life feel like hers. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to have a morning that would force her to finally say some of this out loud. Susan started visiting more often that year. She never said it out loud, but Margaret knew why. It wasn't just love, though. There was plenty of that. It was worry. The kind of worry a daughter carries, quietly checking in a little more than she used to, calling a little more often, showing up on a Tuesday afternoon for no particular reason at all. One of those Tuesdays, Susan arrived with a bag of groceries and found her mother in the living room, trying to get up from her favorite chair. It should have been nothing. Margaret had gotten up from that chair thousands of times. But her knee had locked up that morning worse than usual, and what should have taken 2 seconds turned into a slow, careful production. Hand braced on the armrest, weight shifting forward, a held breath, a small sound she didn't mean to make out loud. Susan set the groceries down fast and crossed the room. Here, Mom, I can do it. The words came out sharper than Margaret intended. Susan's stopped hand still half extended, and there was a beat of silence between them that felt longer than it was. Okay, Susan said gently. Okay. Margaret got up. It took a few extra seconds, and it hurt more than she let her face show, but she did it on her own. Susan didn't say anything else about it. She never did. She just quietly moved the groceries to the counter and started putting things away, chatting about her son's soccer schedule, as if nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. Margaret felt it the rest of the afternoon, sitting underneath the ordinary conversation like a stone at the bottom of a pond. Her daughter had reached out to catch her, and some part of Margaret, the part that used to carry Susan on her hip, that used to be the one reaching out, the one catching, had wanted to disappear into the floor. Later that evening, after Susan had gone home, Margaret went into the bathroom to get ready for bed. She turned on the light. She looked at herself in the mirror the way she had 100 times before, and this time, without any warning at all, she started to cry, not loudly, just quietly standing there, in her nightgown, with the water running tears, coming faster than she could explain them. She wasn't crying only because her knee hurt. She had cried about pain before in private on the worst days. This was different. This was something underneath the pain. Something the pain had been carrying toward her for a long time and had finally set down at her feet. She was afraid, not of the ache in her joints, of what the ache in her joints seemed to be pointing toward. She was afraid of losing her independence of a day coming when getting up from a chair wasn't something she could manage on her own anymore, no matter how sharp her voice got. She was afraid of becoming a burden to Susan, of turning her daughter's life into a series of worried phone calls and rearranged schedules. She was afraid of losing her dignity piece by piece, in small moments like the one in the living room that afternoon. She was afraid of losing the simple ability to care for herself, to cook her own meals, drive her own car walk, into her own garden. She was afraid of watching her world keep shrinking the way it already had been shrinking for years, one canceled outing at a time. And underneath all of that, if she was honest with herself, standing there with the faucet still running, she was afraid of eventually losing everything. Not just her knees. Everything. Herself. Margaret turned off the water. She dried her face with a hand towel that had hung on the same rack for 15 years, and she looked at herself again in the mirror, an older woman, tired, a little frightened, still standing. And here is the thing worth naming clearly, because it's the hinge this whole story turns on. Margaret wasn't only afraid of pain, she was afraid of what pain meant. The ache in her knee was one thing, but the fear underneath it, the fear about tomorrow and next year and everything after that, was something else entirely. That night, lying in bed, Margaret didn't know it, but she was standing right at the edge of a very old idea, an idea that had nothing to do with modern medicine or physical therapy or anything a doctor could put in a prescription, an idea that was more than 2,500 years old. And it's exactly where an ancient Buddhist teaching begins to become surprisingly relevant to a very modern, very human problem. To understand what was waiting for Margaret on the other side of that difficult night, we have to go back more than 2,500 years to a very different world and a teacher who understood something about the human mind that still holds up today. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. We know him now as the Buddha. And one of his most well-known teachings is a short story, sometimes called the parable of the two arrows. It goes something like this. Imagine a person is struck by an arrow. It hits them and it hurts. There's no getting around that. An arrow in the body causes real physical pain, but then the Buddha said something else often happens. A second arrow follows the first, and this second arrow is different. It doesn't come from outside. It comes from the mind's own reaction to what just happened. The first arrow is what happens to us. The second arrow is what we do inside our own minds with what happened. Let's slow down and make this concrete, because it's easy to hear a phrase like two arrows and let it float by as a nice metaphor without really landing. The first arrow represents things that happen to us that we did not choose and often cannot control. Physical pain, illness, aging, loss, disappointment. A diagnosis you didn't ask for. A knee that used to work and now doesn't. A husband who isn't there anymore to walk beside you in the park. The first arrow hurts. There is no version of this teaching that pretends otherwise. The Buddha was not interested in telling people that pain isn't real or that suffering is a choice, or that if you simply thought about it differently, the arrow would somehow stop hurting. The first arrow hurts, full stop. But then comes the second arrow, and the second arrow is made almost entirely out of thought. It sounds something like this. Why me? This is never going to end. My life is ruined. I'm useless now. Nobody understands what this is like. I'm terrified of what's coming next. I can't stand this. I used to be a different person, a better person, a stronger person, and that person is gone. Notice something about every one of those sentences. None of them are describing a physical sensation. They're describing a story about a physical sensation. And here is where this teaching is often misunderstood. So let's be very clear about it, because getting this wrong can do real harm. This is not about blaming people for their own suffering. The Buddha was not standing in front of someone in agony and saying, "Your pain is your fault. You're just choosing to suffer. Get over it." That is not the teaching. And if anyone ever presents it to you that way, they've misunderstood it. The message is something much gentler and much more useful. The mind can sometimes add another layer of suffering on top of an already difficult experience, not because the person is weak, not because they're doing something wrong, but because that's simply what minds do. It's what your mind does. It's what my mind does. It's an old, deeply human habit wired into us for reasons that once helped us survive. Let's use a few everyday examples, because this teaching becomes much clearer with real life attached to it. A sore knee on its own is a physical sensation. Ache, stiffness, maybe some sharpness when you move a certain way. That's the first arrow. But very quickly, for many of us, that sensation turns into a sentence. I won't be able to walk anymore. That sentence is the second arrow. A bad night of sleep is the first arrow. I'll never sleep properly again as long as I live is the second. Needing help carrying in the groceries or getting up out of a chair is the first arrow. I'm becoming useless. I'm becoming a burden is the second. A doctor delivering a diagnosis is the first arrow. My life is over, spoken in your own mind sometimes within seconds of hearing the news is the second. Do you see the pattern? One physical sensation, one piece of difficult news, one hard moment, and almost instantly, the mind builds an entire chain of thought around it. A story about the future, a verdict about who we are now, a prediction about how everything is going to go from here on out. And that second arrow, that story, often causes far more suffering than the original sensation ever did. This is important enough to say directly because we don't want anyone watching this video to misunderstand what's being offered here. The Buddha was not telling sick people to think their way out of illness. He was not saying that pain isn't real or that if you just meditate hard enough, your arthritis will disappear. He was pointing to something much subtler than that. The difference between experiencing pain and becoming completely consumed by our reaction to pain. Those are two different things. They can feel like the same thing, especially on a hard day, but they are not the same thing. And the space between them is exactly where this entire video is going to spend its time. Let's bring this back to Margaret for a moment, because her story is really where all of this becomes real instead of abstract. Her knee, the ache, the stiffness, the sharp reminder every time she stood up too quickly, that was her first arrow. Real, physical, not something she was imagining, not something a positive attitude was going to erase, but the fear underneath it. The fear she finally let herself cry about in front of the bathroom mirror, the fear of becoming a burden, of losing her independence, of disappearing a little more each year. That fear was largely made of second arrows. Thoughts, predictions, stories about a future that hadn't happened yet. Her knee hurt. That was one thing. Her mind had also quietly decided that the ache in her knee meant her whole life was ending. That was something else entirely. And here is the sentence worth carrying with you through the rest of this video, because everything else we're going to talk about builds on it. The first arrow may not always be in our control. We don't get to choose whether our knees get older. We don't get to choose every illness, every loss, every hard morning that finds us. But perhaps with some patience and some practice, we can learn to recognize the second arrow, that story, that spiral, that verdict about the future before we fire it at ourselves. That recognition doesn't make the first arrow stop hurting, but it can change almost everything about what happens after it lands. Before we go any further, we need to stop and say something clearly, because this is exactly the point in a video like this, where good intentions can accidentally cause harm. If you live with chronic pain, you have almost certainly heard some version of the following. Just think positively. Mind over matter. It's all in your head. Have you tried just not focusing on it? Maybe it came from a well-meaning friend. Maybe a relative who has never lived with real ongoing pain. Maybe even at some point from your own inner voice, tired and frustrated, trying to talk yourself out of something that wasn't going anywhere, no matter how hard you tried to think your way past it. Let's be completely clear. That is not what this video is telling you. That is not what the Buddha was teaching. And if anyone has ever told you that your chronic pain is simply a failure of attitude, they were wrong. And it's worth saying gently that they were wrong. People living with chronic pain should never be told to just think positively, as though a stiff, aching knee will loosen up because you've decided to smile more. People living with chronic pain should never be told that their pain is all in their head, as though decades of arthritis or nerve damage or worn-out joint were nothing more than an idea they could simply choose to stop having. And nothing in this video is a suggestion to abandon appropriate medical care. If your doctor has you on medication, stay on your medication. If you need physical therapy, go to physical therapy. If something in your body concerns you or changes or feels wrong, take it seriously and talk to a professional who can actually examine you. Nothing we talk about today replaces that. Nothing here is medical advice, and nothing here should be mistaken for it. So if this isn't about positive thinking, and it isn't a replacement for medical care, what exactly is it? It's about our relationship with our experience, not a denial of the experience itself. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this video, so let's sit with it for a moment. Pain can be physical. It is physical. It lives in the body in a joint, a nerve, a muscle, a spine that's carried you for 7 or 8 decades. Pain can be exhausting, wearing a person down, not just physically, but emotionally, day after day, the way water eventually wears down stone. Pain can be frightening, especially when you don't fully understand what's causing it or whether it's going to get worse. Pain can be frustrating, interrupting plans, canceling outings, turning simple errands into calculations. And pain can be unpredictable, showing up on days it has no business showing up, and occasionally mercifully easing on days you expected the worst. All of that is real. Sometimes pain really does interfere with sleep. It really does affect how you move through your own house. It really can strain relationships when the people who love you don't fully understand what a bad day actually feels like from the inside. We're not here to talk you out of any of that. We're here to introduce a different question. Not, how do I make this stop? Which is a question many people have already spent years and a great deal of money trying to answer. The question is this: is there a way to be present with what's happening in my body without automatically adding a second layer of fear and story on top of it? Mindfulness, and we'll use that word carefully throughout this video without turning it into a buzzword, begins not by changing reality, but by becoming willing to see reality clearly. Not the story about the reality itself. This brings us to a concept from Buddhist teaching called anicca, which is simply the idea of impermanence. The fact that nothing stays exactly the same, not even as strange as this might sound, pain itself. If you've lived with chronic pain for any length of time, you may have noticed something you've never really stopped to examine. Pain isn't a flat, unchanging thing. It moves, it shifts, it has texture. A sensation might change in intensity, sharper one moment, duller the next. It might change location, moving from the outside of the knee to somewhere deeper or spreading slightly, or easing in one spot while appearing in another. It might change in temperature, feeling hot and inflamed at one point, cooler and more like a dull pressure a little later. It might change in rhythm, pulsing, then steady, then pulsing again. Most of us never notice any of this because the moment pain arrives, we do something almost automatic. We slap a label on it: bad, terrible, unbearable, and then we stop paying close attention. We start reacting instead of observing. Understandably, nobody wants to sit quietly and study something painful, but this teaching invites something different, gently, without pressure. Instead of immediately reacting, what if you could notice just for a moment, just as an experiment, how the sensation is actually behaving right now in this breath, rather than assuming it will always feel exactly the way it feels at its worst? This isn't about pretending pain is pleasant. It isn't about convincing yourself that suffering is secretly good for you or that you should be grateful for it. You don't have to love the pain. You don't have to pretend it's a blessing in disguise. You only have to stop making war with yourself because it's there. That's the whole invitation at its heart. Not to defeat the pain, not to transcend it in some dramatic movie-worthy way. Just to stop adding a battle on top of a battle you're already fighting. And in the next section, we're going to show you exactly what that looks like, not as an abstract idea, but as something you can actually try the same way Margaret first tried it, sitting alone in her kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. So what does this actually look like in real life? Not as a philosophy, not as an idea to think about later on a day when you have more energy. What does it look like right now in a body that hurts on an ordinary afternoon? Let's walk through it together, the same way Margaret first walked through it slowly, without expecting very much. There's no special posture required for this. You don't need a cushion. You don't need candles or incense or anything that makes this feel like it belongs to a world far away from your living room. You can sit in your favorite chair, you can lie in bed, you can do this in the recliner with the television off, or outside on the porch if the weather's kind to you today. Step 1 is simply this: get as comfortable as your body allows, right where you already are. Step 2 is to take a few slow breaths. Nothing forced, nothing dramatic. Just breathing a little more slowly, a little more, on purpose than you usually do. In, out, in, out. Step 3 is where the real practice begins. Gently bring your attention toward whatever sensation is present in your body right now. It might be your knee, it might be your back, your hip, your hands. Wherever it is, let your attention move toward it, the way you might walk toward someone standing at a distance, unhurried without alarm. Here's the part that takes a little practice because it goes against a habit most of us have had our whole lives. Try not to immediately call it terrible pain. Instead, see if you can notice it the way you'd notice weather. Not good weather or bad weather, just weather. What is actually here physically right now? Is it pressure? Is it heat? Is it tightness? Like something being gently squeezed? Is it pulsing, rising and falling in a rhythm? Is it sharp in one small point, or dull spread out over a wider area? Is there movement in it at all, or does it feel still? You're not trying to get the right answer here. There isn't one. You're simply getting curious about something you've probably been avoiding looking at too closely, because looking at it closely used to only mean bracing for how bad it might be. Step 4. Ask yourself a quiet question without demanding an answer right away. Is it exactly the same from one moment to the next? Just sit with that for a few seconds. Most people, when they actually stop and check, discover something they'd never noticed before. The sensation isn't flat, it isn't frozen, it moves even slightly. It might ease for a breath, then return. It might shift from sharp to dull, or from one spot to somewhere just beside it. Step 5, and this is the heart of the whole exercise: observe without trying to force the sensation away. This is the hardest part, and it's worth saying so plainly. Every instinct you have will want to fight this feeling, escape it, distract from it, or demand that it leave immediately. Those instincts aren't wrong. They're human. But for just a few breaths, see if you can set the fighting down without giving up, without surrendering, just resting for a moment, and simply noticing what's here. Let's slow down even further now, the way Margaret eventually learned to. Sit for a moment. Breathe. You don't have to fix anything right now. Breathe. You are simply observing what is already here. There's pressure in the knee. Notice it. Breathe. It's changing slightly. Notice that too. Breathe. You don't have to like it. You don't have to call it good. You only have to see it clearly for these few breaths without adding a story on top of it. Breathe. That's it. That's the whole practice, at least for now. Here is the goal stated as plainly as we can state it, because it's easy to misunderstand what this exercise is actually for. The goal is not make the pain disappear. If you sit down expecting the ache in your knee to vanish because you breathed at it for 2 minutes, you will almost certainly be disappointed, and you might decide the whole thing doesn't work. The goal is something smaller, and honestly something more useful. Create a little space between the sensation and your reaction to it, that's all. A little space, not a cure, not a miracle, just a small gap opened up by attention and breath between what your body is feeling and what your mind immediately wants to do about it. Let's go back to Margaret for a moment, because this is exactly where she started. She tried this for the first time on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, sitting at her kitchen table, coffee gone lukewarm beside her. She felt a little foolish at first, closing her eyes in her own kitchen in the middle of the day, breathing on purpose, like this was something out of a magazine article. She didn't experience anything close to a miracle. Her knees still ached the whole time. If anything, sitting still made her more aware of it, not less. But something did happen, something small and easy to miss if she hadn't been paying close attention. She noticed that the sensation changed. For a moment, it was sharper near the inside of the joint. A breath later, it dulled slightly, spreading a little wider, softer at the edges. It wasn't one solid block of pain, unmoving, unchangeable, the way it had always felt in her mind. It had texture. It had rhythm. It was in its own uncomfortable way alive and shifting rather than a fixed sentence handed down about the rest of her day. That was all. No transformation. No sudden peace. Just a small, quiet observation. This isn't quite what I thought it was. And sometimes that's exactly where change actually begins. Not with a breakthrough. with a small crack of curiosity opening just slightly in a place that used to be sealed shut with fear. Sitting quietly in a kitchen chair is one thing, but most of us don't have the luxury of stopping everything, closing our eyes, and observing our pain every single time it shows up. Life doesn't pause to let that happen. Pain arrives while you're standing at the sink. It arrives while you're getting out of the car in a parking lot. It arrives in the middle of a grocery store, 3 aisles from where you started with a cart half full, and your hips suddenly reminding you it's there. So Margaret needed something smaller, something she could carry with her into ordinary moments without needing a quiet room or 20 free minutes. That's where the 3-breath pause comes in. It's exactly what it sounds like. 3 breaths. That's the whole practice. But each breath carries a specific quiet intention, and together they can interrupt a pattern that's had years, sometimes decades, to build itself into a habit. The first breath is simply this: I know there is pain. Not, I hate that there's pain. Not, why is this happening again? Just a plain acknowledgement of what's actually true right now in this moment. I know there is pain. That might sound too simple to matter, but there's something important happening underneath it. So often our first response to pain is a kind of internal resistance, a flinch, a denial, an immediate wish that things were different than they are. Acknowledging the pain plainly and without drama is actually a small act of honesty. It stops the fight before it starts. The second breath is this: I don't have to fight this moment. This isn't surrender. It isn't giving up or deciding that nothing can be done or resigning yourself to a life you don't want. It's something much narrower than that. It's simply choosing not to go to war right now in this specific instant with a sensation that has already arrived, whether you fight it or not. There's a difference between accepting a moment and accepting a diagnosis. You can still see your doctor. You can still take your medication, adjust your posture, ask for help, do everything sensible and reasonable about your condition. Accepting this moment doesn't mean accepting defeat. It means not adding a second battle fought entirely in your mind on top of the one your body is already having. The third breath is this: may I be gentle with myself. Not may I be strong. Not may I push through this like I used to. Just gentleness. A small kindness offered to yourself in a moment when it would be easy to do the opposite, to grow frustrated, to grow angry, to start talking to yourself the way you'd never talk to someone you loved. 3 breaths, 3 simple phrases. That's the whole practice, and it can happen almost anywhere. Standing at the edge of the bed in the morning before that first difficult movement, sitting in a chair, gathering yourself before standing, at the bottom of a staircase, looking up at what used to be nothing at all and is now something to plan for. Reaching for the door handle of the car, knowing the next few seconds will take more effort than they used to. Standing at the stove, waiting for a wave of stiffness to ease before reaching for the next pan. Lying in bed at night, when the ache makes it hard to settle hard to let go into sleep. None of these moments require you to stop what you're doing for very long. 3 breaths takes perhaps 15 seconds, but those 15 seconds can change what happens next. Let's go back to Margaret, because there's a moment worth telling you about. She was in the grocery store on a Thursday afternoon, halfway down the cereal aisle, when her knee suddenly locked sharp and unexpected, the kind of pain that makes you grab the cart handle a little tighter and stand very still. The old Margaret, and by old, we simply mean the Margaret of a few months earlier, would have had an immediate, automatic reaction. Oh no, not again, not here. What if I can't make it to the car? What if someone sees me struggling? What if this is only going to get worse from here? All of that in the space of about 2 seconds before she'd even finished processing what her knee felt like. This time, something different happened. She stopped where she stood. She breathed. I know there is pain. She breathed again. I don't have to fight this moment. And a third time, may I be gentle with myself. Then she adjusted. She shifted her weight to her other leg. She leaned on the cart a little more than usual, and when a store employee stocking shelves nearby asked if she needed help getting to the register, Margaret, who a year earlier might have insisted she was fine out of pure stubborn pride, simply said, "Actually, yes, thank you." She finished her shopping. She got to her car. Her knee still hurt the whole time, but the trip to the grocery store didn't turn it into a catastrophe in her mind. It stayed what it actually was, an ordinary errand, with one uncomfortable stretch in the middle of it, rather than proof of everything she was afraid of. This brings us to something worth saying clearly, because it can be easy to misunderstand mindfulness as a kind of quiet, solitary toughness. Mindfulness does not mean doing everything alone. Asking for help can itself be mindful. There's no failure in accepting an arm to lean on a hand, reaching out an offer to carry the bag you'd normally carry yourself. The old story might have said that needing help meant weakness, meant becoming a burden, meant losing something important. But there's another way to see it. Accepting help when help is offered with love isn't a defeat. It's simply one more way of being gentle with yourself out loud in front of another person. There's a kind of anger that many older adults carry quietly and rarely talk about. It isn't anger at another person. It isn't even most of the time anger at a diagnosis or a doctor or an unfair set of circumstances. It's anger at their own body. Margaret felt it more than once, standing in front of the bathroom mirror looking at hands that used to move quickly through a garden bed and now moved carefully, deliberately, like they belonged to someone she was still getting to know. What happened to me? That question asked in front of a mirror rarely comes with kindness attached to it. More often it comes with something closer to betrayal, as if the body had made a promise long ago and quietly broken it. We remember, whether we say it out loud or not, what we used to be able to do. Legs that used to carry us up a flight of stairs without a second thought. Skin that used to hold its shape without so many lines mapped across it. A sense of balance we never once had to think about stepping off a curb, reaching for something on a high shelf. A kind of independence so complete we didn't even recognize it as a gift because we'd never lived without it. Grief over an aging body is completely understandable. Losing physical ability, even gradually, even in small pieces, is a real loss, and it deserves to be grieved rather than dismissed. But there's a difference between grieving a loss and declaring war on the thing that's changing. Constant hostility toward your own body, the daily frustration, the muttered comments in the mirror, the quiet resentment simmering underneath ordinary tasks creates another layer of suffering on top of what's already difficult. It's another version of the second arrow, aimed inward, fired at the one part of you that has never once left your side. Because here's something worth pausing on. Whatever else has changed in Margaret's life, her husband gone, her children grown. Her walks shortened her days, rearranged around what her knees will tolerate. Her body has been with her through every single bit of it. It carried her through childbirth. It carried her through decades of standing at a stove, cooking dinner for a family that grew and then scattered the way families do. It carried her through burying her husband, standing at a graveside on a cold October morning, upright present there, when she wasn't sure she had it in her to be there at all. It has never once left. Even now, aching and slower and less reliable than it used to be, it is still here, still doing its best, still carrying her from the bed to the bathroom, from the kitchen to the porch, from one day into the next. This brings us to a practice that Margaret found unexpectedly to be one of the hardest and most important of all. If it feels comfortable to you, you can place a hand gently on your body right now, over your heart or on your knee or wherever feels right. If that's not comfortable, that's fine too. You can simply let the words settle in on their own. Silently or quietly, out loud, if you're alone, try saying this to yourself. This body has carried me for many years. Let that sit for a moment. It has been through difficult seasons. Let that sit too. I don't have to hate it for changing. And finally, may I treat this body with kindness. This is not magical healing. Nobody's knee has ever regenerated cartilage because someone spoke kindly to it. That's not what's being offered here, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. What is being offered is a change in relationship, a shift from treating your own body like an opponent, something to be fought and defeated and resented, toward treating it like an old tired companion who has been walking beside you this entire time, doing the best it can with what it has left to give. There's a small moment in Margaret's story worth telling you about here. One afternoon, cleaning out the garage, she came across those old walking shoes, again worn heels, faded soles, a little dried mud still caught in the grooves. For years, every time she'd seen them, they had felt like an accusation. Proof of what she used to be able to do. Proof of what she'd lost. This time standing there with the garage door open and afternoon light falling across the concrete floor, something shifted quietly without any announcement. She picked them up. She turned them over in her hands, and instead of seeing them as evidence of what her body could no longer do, she found herself seeing something else. These shoes had walked her through decades of ordinary mornings. They had walked her down the aisle at Susan's wedding rehearsal when the wedding planner insisted on comfortable shoes for the walkthrough. They had walked beside Daniel on 100 quiet Saturday loops through the park. They had carried her feet mile after mile, year after year, through a life that had been on the whole a good one. She wasn't angry at the shoes anymore, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't quite as angry at the feet that had worn them either. That shift didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't dramatic. It was small and quiet, and it happened while she was doing nothing more remarkable than standing in a garage on an ordinary afternoon. But it mattered, because the way we relate to our own bodies shapes almost everything else. How we move through pain, how we ask for help, how we speak to ourselves on the hardest days. And learning to stop fighting your own body doesn't mean giving up on it. It means finally, after all these years, treating it like it deserves to be treated. With patience, with gratitude, and with a little bit of kindness. To close out this part of the story, we want to tell you about someone else. Not Margaret this time, but a real teacher whose life offers one of the clearest examples in Buddhist history of what we've been talking about this whole video. His name was Ajahn Chah. He was a Thai Buddhist monk and meditation master born in a small village in northeastern Thailand in the early 20th century, who went on to become one of the most influential teachers in the modern Theravada Buddhist tradition. He founded monasteries. He trained generations of monks, including many Westerners who traveled to Thailand specifically to study under him. His teaching style was famously plain direct and rooted in ordinary life, rather than abstract philosophy, much like the ideas we've been walking through together in this video. In his later years, Ajahn Chah developed a serious illness that left him increasingly unable to speak or move on his own. It was by any account a difficult and painful decline, the kind that would test any one teacher or not. According to accounts from students who were close to him during that period when people asked how he was doing, he offered a response that has been passed down and repeated many times since, because it captures something so simply and so clearly. The teaching attributed to him is this: that yes, there was pain in his body, but his mind was not suffering because of it. We want to be honest with you here. Exact wording can shift a little across different retellings of a teaching passed down mostly through oral tradition and translation. What matters far more than the precise sentence is the meaning underneath it, a meaning that fits perfectly with everything we've talked about today. Ajahn Chah was not denying his illness. He was not pretending his body wasn't failing him in very real, very physical ways. He was not performing some kind of spiritual toughness, gritting his teeth and insisting he felt nothing. The teaching points towards something much more specific than denial. It points toward a distinction between the body and the mind's relationship to the body. The body can experience pain, real, undeniable physical pain, without the entire mind becoming trapped inside that pain, consumed by it, defined by it. That's the whole teaching really stated, as simply as it can be stated. The pain can be there. The suffering doesn't have to multiply on top of it. Now, here's something worth saying clearly, because it would be easy to hear a story like this and feel a little defeated by it. Margaret doesn't need to become a monk. You don't need to become a monk. Nobody watching this video needs to sit in silence for years, or give up their home, or dedicate their life to formal meditation practice in order to benefit from what Ajahn Chah understood. He spent decades training his mind to reach that place. Most of us will never get there in the same complete way, and that's all right. That was never the goal of this video. What Margaret needed, what any of us need, is something much smaller and much more within reach. The same basic movement practiced imperfectly, a little at a time on ordinary days. Notice, breathe, allow, respond wisely. That's it. That's the whole shape of the practice, whether you're a monk who has spent 40 years in a monastery or a 72-year-old woman in Ohio trying to get out of a kitchen chair. There's a kind of freedom being pointed to here that's worth sitting with for a moment, because it isn't the kind of freedom most of us grow up expecting. Perhaps freedom isn't always the freedom to change what happens to the body. Margaret couldn't make her knee 20 years younger. Ajahn Chah couldn't undo his illness. There are some arrows none of us get to dodge, no matter how much we wish otherwise. But perhaps freedom can also mean something else. The ability to remain present when the body is asking for your attention, rather than disappearing entirely into fear about what it means. The ability to feel pain without handing your entire mind over to it. The ability to say honestly and without pretending, yes, this hurts, and also, I am still here. I am still myself. This pain has not taken all of me. That's not a small thing. It might in fact be one of the most important things a person can learn, especially in the second half of life, when the body starts asking more of our attention than it used to. Margaret was still a long way from where Ajahn Chah had arrived after a lifetime of practice. She never expected to get there fully, and she didn't need to, but she had started walking in that direction. And walking in that direction, even slowly, even imperfectly, turned out to matter more than she ever expected it would. We need to be honest with you about something, because a video like this can accidentally make all of this sound easier than it actually is. Margaret did not wake up one morning fully transformed, breathing her way calmly through every hard moment for the rest of her life. That's not how any of this works, and if a video ever promises you that, be skeptical of it. There was a day several weeks after she'd started practicing that Margaret would later describe as one of the worst she'd had in a long time. Her back had seized up overnight. Her knee ached in a way that made even sitting down feel like a negotiation. And on top of all of it, she'd slept badly, which has a way of making everything else feel sharper than it is. She tried the 3-breath pause sitting on the edge of her bed that morning. I know there is pain. Breathe. I don't have to fight this moment. Breathe. May I be. She stopped. She didn't finish the 3rd breath. Instead, something in her simply snapped quietly but completely the way a rubber band finally gives after being stretched one too many times. This doesn't work, she said out loud to no one in an empty bedroom. She was angry, not at any one thing in particular, at the pain, at the years, at the slow, grinding unfairness of a body that used to do whatever she asked of it, and now seemed to negotiate every single request. She sat there for a while, arms crossed, jaw tight, feeling every bit as trapped as she had felt on the very first morning we told you about at the beginning of this video. This is important, so let's slow down here. Mindfulness does not mean becoming a person who never gets angry, never gets frustrated, never has a bad morning, where none of it seems to help. The practice was never react. If that's what you've been expecting from yourself, it's worth letting that expectation go right now, because it's setting you up to feel like a failure for being human. The practice is something much more forgiving than that. Notice that you reacted and begin again. That's the whole thing, not perfection, not some unbroken record of calm, stretching from one end of your life to the other. Just noticing eventually, sometimes minutes later, sometimes hours later, that you'd been swept away and gently, without punishing yourself for it coming back. Later that same difficult morning, Margaret sat back down on the edge of her bed. She didn't force herself to feel grateful. She wasn't going to pretend the anger hadn't happened or that the pain had suddenly become bearable because she'd decided it should be. She simply breathed again, not because the breath fixed anything. It didn't, not right away. But because breathing again after losing her footing was itself the practice, maybe even the most important part of it. A spiritual practice is not proven on the days when everything is easy. It becomes meaningful on the days you lose your balance and remember that you're allowed to begin again. Let's be honest about where Margaret ended up, because she deserves an honest ending, not a fairy tale one. Margaret was not cured. Her knee did not heal. Her back did not become young again. Her body at 72 remained exactly what it was, an aging body, carrying the wear of decades, still capable of aching on a Tuesday for no particular reason at all. The pain still comes. Some mornings are easier than others. Some are genuinely hard, the kind where getting out of bed takes every bit as much effort as it did on that very first morning we told you about. But something did change, quietly over months, without any single dramatic turning point she could point back to. She stopped predicting disaster every time discomfort showed up. A hard morning was allowed to just be a hard morning instead of automatic proof that everything was falling apart. She started asking for help without the shame that used to come attached to it. When Susan reached out a hand, now more often than not, Margaret took it. She began enjoying her coffee again, actually tasting it, actually noticing the warmth of the mug in her hands, instead of drinking it on autopilot while her mind ran ahead to everything that might go wrong that day. She spent more time outside, not walking for an hour the way she used to, sometimes just 10 minutes on the porch, sitting in the old chair, feeling the air on her face. She talked with her grandchildren differently too, more present, less distracted by the quiet inventory of aches she used to run every time she sat down to listen to them. And she started noticing small moments that pain, it turned out, had never actually been able to take away from her. The particular gold color of late afternoon light across her kitchen floor, the sound of a bird outside her window in the early morning, The specific, unrepeatable way her grandson laughed when he thought something was truly funny. None of that had ever required a body without pain. She simply hadn't been able to see it clearly before, because so much of her attention had been swallowed up by fear about what was coming next. Here is the sentence that more than any other describes what actually happened to Margaret over those months. Pain was still part of her life. It simply wasn't the author of every chapter anymore. It still showed up. It still had something to say most mornings. But it no longer got to write the whole story, decide every plan, cancel every outing, narrate every quiet moment with a warning about what might happen next. Margaret had gotten her life back. Not the one she used to have exactly. That version, the one with 2 strong knees and an hour-long morning walk, wasn't coming back, and she'd made a kind of peace with that. But a life that was still hers. Still full of small, real, ordinary things worth paying attention to, and that, it turns out, was enough. We want to slow down for a moment now and speak directly to you. Maybe you're watching this in a recliner with the television paused and a cup of tea going cold beside you. Maybe you're in bed, propped up against a pillow, watching this quietly while someone else in the house sleeps. Maybe it's late at night and you're alone, and something about tonight made you search for a video like this one in the first place. Wherever you are, we want to say something to you plainly. Your body may be changing. You may not be able to do everything you once did without a second thought. Some things may hurt more than you'd like to admit out loud, even to the people who love you. Some things may already be lost. A walk. You used to take a job. You used to do a version of your own hands. You used to trust without thinking twice. All of that may be true. And still, your worth has not disappeared. You are not your arthritis. You are not your back pain. You are not your diagnosis, whatever letters or numbers a doctor may have attached to a folder with your name on it. You are not the number of pill bottles lined up on your nightstand. You are not the list of things your body can no longer do without help. You are the person who has been paying attention this whole time. The one who is still here, still noticing, still capable of warmth, of humor, of love, of curiosity about a bird outside the window or a grandchild's laugh from another room. That part of you was never touched by the arrow at all. Here is perhaps the most important sentence in this entire video, and if you remember nothing else, we hope you'll carry this one with you. The goal is not to create a life without pain. For most of us at a certain age, that simply isn't realistic, and chasing it as the only measure of success will only add more suffering on top of what's already there. The goal is to create a life in which pain does not take away everything else. A life where an aching knee can exist in the same morning as a good cup of coffee. A life where a hard night's sleep can be followed by an ordinary, decent day. A life where you can say honestly, yes, this hurts, and also, I am still here, and there is still something worth paying attention to. Let's go back one more time to where we began. Margaret, waking up at 6:17 in the morning. She still feels it most days. The knees, the back, the stiffness in her hands that never fully goes away. But now, before her feet even touch the floor, she takes 3 slow breaths. She doesn't rush to name the day as good or bad before it's even begun. She opens the curtains. Morning light moves slowly across the room the way it has for 72 years, the way it did when the house was full of children's shoes in the hallway, and the way it still does now in a quieter house that holds just as much life if she's willing to look for it. Nothing miraculous has happened. Her knee is exactly the same knee it was on that very first morning we told you about. And yet something important has changed. She is still here, and the day, whatever it holds, is still hers. Before you go, we want to ask you something. Not like and subscribe. Not the kind of thing you hear at the end of every video and stop listening to halfway through. Something a little more real. If you've lived with chronic pain, if you've watched your own body change, if you've had mornings like the one Margaret had, the kind where you lie there for a moment before your feet even touch the floor, you already know something the rest of us can only try to understand from the outside. We'd genuinely like to hear it. What has pain taught you about life? Or, if that feels like too big a question this evening, maybe this one instead. What helps you get through the difficult days? You might share a lesson you've learned the hard way. A small victory nobody else would think, to celebrate a walk to the mailbox and back, a morning you managed on your own, a moment you asked for help instead of white-knuckling through it alone. Something you wish someone had told you years earlier before you had to learn it the slow way. Or simply a practice, a habit, a small ritual that gets you through a hard morning. Write it in the comments if you're willing. Here's why it matters more than you might think. Someone else is going to read what you write. Maybe tonight, maybe next week. Someone sitting alone hurting frightened, wondering if anyone else understands what this actually feels like from the inside. You never know who may be reading your words. Your story, the ordinary, unglamorous truth of how you get through a hard day, may be exactly what reminds a stranger that they are not alone in this. If this video meant something to you, consider subscribing. We'll be sharing more stories like Margaret's about aging, about loss, about loneliness, about purpose, about family, about acceptance, and about the quiet, practical wisdom found in Buddhist teaching, all of it offered gently for people walking through the second half of life. Final line. Your body may hurt, your life may have changed, but there is still a place inside you that pain does not have to take away. May you meet whatever comes next with a little less fear, a little more kindness, and a peaceful heart.